Mother and her 3 children murdered.
Her husband is found in Mexico pretending to be a New York Times writer. 48 Hours' Maureen Marr says that's when the murder case became a Hollywood movie.
We got a report of a child in the bay. They discovered a second child. We knew that our focal suspect was going to be Chris Longo.
I learned that while Christian Longo was in Mexico, he was pretending to be a writer for the New York Times. In fact, he was pretending to be me.
On a cold December day in 2001, a horrifying discovery was made off the coast of Oregon. The lifeless body of 4-year-old Zachary Longo was found floating near the shore. Hours later, police divers uncovered the body of his 3-year-old sister, Sadie. But the nightmare was only just beginning. Days later, 2 suitcases were pulled from the bay. Inside were the remains of their 2-year-old sister, Madison, and their mother, Mary Jane. While the town was still trying to process the tragedy, investigators found a truth more disturbing than they ever expected. The killer was their own father, Christian Longo. He had strangled his wife and youngest daughter, drowned his other children. Soon after, he fled to Cancun, Mexico, living under a stolen identity. The brutality of his crimes and his brazen escape led the FBI to name him one of their top 10 most wanted fugitives. What kind of father could look his children in the eyes and kill them? What secret life was Christian Longo hiding before everything fell apart? And how did the FBI finally track him down? And what happened when justice finally caught up with him? This is a story of shattered trust, innocent lives stolen, and the twisted path of a man who ran from the horrors he created. Welcome to Crime Aura, where the darkest true crime stories come to life. We bring you gripping stories every week, so make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications to stay in the loop. Now, let's dive into today's story. On December 19th, 2001, in Waldport, Oregon. It started like any other quiet day in this coastal town. But that morning, the peace of the Waldport RV park was shattered. Detective Trish Miller of the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office was called out to the scene after a disturbing call came in from a man staying at the park. The man had seen something unsettling floating in the water near a nearby bridge. When authorities arrived and peered into the murky water, their worst fears were confirmed. There, face down and motionless, was the small body of a young child. Emergency responders quickly retrieved the child's body from the water. The boy looked to be about 4 or 5 years old. But what struck investigators immediately was something far more troubling. No missing child report matched his description. There were no alerts, no frantic parents calling 911, no communities on edge searching for a lost little boy. That's when things got strange. When a child dies, it's always heartbreaking. But when no one even notices they're missing, that raises questions, dark questions. Unable to identify the victim and desperate for leads, the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office made a bold move. They released an image of the boy's face to the media, and the face made its way into the homes of Oregonians across the state. And in one of those homes, a woman named Denise Thompson was watching the news. As the screen flickered to the image of the little boy, Denise froze and stared at the screen, heart pounding. The police were asking for help identifying the child, claiming he had been found dead near a local RV park. She knew that face. It looked exactly like 4-year-old Zachary Longo, a boy she babysat regularly, along with his 2 younger sisters, Sadie and Madison. The Longos had been a familiar part of her life, and Zachary, there was no mistaking him. Hoping, praying that she was wrong, she drove straight to the police station. At the station, Denise explained that she worked with Christian Longo, the boy's father, at Starbucks. And although she hoped she was just imagining things, she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in her chest. Then they asked her something difficult. Would she be willing to take a look at the child's body and make a formal identification? Denise, knowing she had to help, agreed. What she saw confirmed her fears. It was Zachary. The sweet, happy boy she had looked after so many times was now lifeless, cold, and gone. But that wasn't all. As Denise was reeling from the confirmation, police told her something even more chilling. While investigating Zachary's death, authorities had discovered another body, this time offshore, just a mile from where Zachary had been found. It was a little girl. Her body had been weighted down with a rock placed inside a pillowcase and tied to her ankle. Like Zachary, she was dressed only in underwear. Police asked Denise if she could take a look at the second child as well. And when she saw the girl, she instantly recognized her as Sadie Longo, Zachary's 3-year-old sister. 2 children, dead, drowned, dumped, and no trace of the rest of the family. Where were their parents? Where was the youngest sibling, 2-year-old Madison? Investigators immediately launched a full-scale effort to find out. They dispatched officers to the apartment complex where the Longo family lived. The scene was eerie. The apartment looked like a family had just been there. Dishes still in the sink, clothes in the closet, signs of life everywhere, but no sign of the family. Everything seemed normal, except for the obvious. The Longos were gone. Back at the station, police continued questioning Denise. They wanted to know what she remembered about the family and if she had noticed anything unusual in the days leading up to the tragedy. She told them the Longos seemed like a perfectly normal family. In fact, just a few days earlier, on the very day Zachary's body was found, Christian Longo had shown up for his shift at Starbucks. But something Christian said that day now stood out. Christian had told Denise she wouldn't be seeing the rest of his family anymore, claiming that he and his wife, Mary Jane, were getting a divorce. Investigators now faced a disturbing possibility. What if the Longos weren't missing? What if they had fled? The pressure was mounting. On December 27, 2001, police made another desperate move. They deployed a team of divers to search the waters near the marina. The logic was simple. Zachary and Sadie had been found in water. Maybe more answers were hidden beneath the surface. They were right. Beneath a dock in the marina, divers discovered 2 suitcases. Inside one suitcase was the naked body of 34-year-old Mary Jane Longo, the mother of the children. She had been strangled and showed signs of blunt force trauma to her face. Inside the other suitcase, the most gut-wrenching discovery of all, was the lifeless body of 2-year-old Madison Longo. A dumbbell had been placed inside the suitcase to keep it submerged. Now 4 of the 5 family members had been found, all dead. But one person was still missing, Christian Longo. Was he the final victim? Police launched a national alert. Christian's face flooded the media, but at first, he was only listed as a person of interest, wanted for questioning. But as days passed and he failed to come forward, suspicions grew. Investigators dug deeper into his life, and what they found painted a dark and disturbing portrait. Christian Longo, it turned out, had been living a double life. Financial troubles, mounting debts, unpaid bills. And now, with the rest of the Longos gone, Christian's absence looked less like a tragedy and more like a cover-up. The media coverage intensified. Christian Longo's face was now on wanted posters, TV broadcasts, and newspapers across the country. Public sentiment shifted. He was no longer just the grieving father. He was suspect number 1. But where was he? That would soon be answered in the most bizarre twist of all. Christian Longo wasn't hiding nearby. He had fled the country, and the manhunt for the family annihilator had begun. To understand how Christian Longo became a murderer, we need to go back to a childhood full of control and quiet rebellion. Christian was born on January 23, 1974, in Iowa. His mother, Joy, was only 16 when she had him. His father, Stephen Stewart, was an alcoholic with a violent temper. He abused Joy, Christian, and Christian's younger brother, Dustin. When Christian was 4, Joy finally walked away from the chaos. She later met Joe Longo, a kind and responsible man she worked with at Target. They got married, and Joe adopted the 2 boys, giving them his last name. From the outside, it looked like things were finally falling into place. Joe's career took off. Joy became a stay-at-home mom, and the family appeared happy. At first, the Longos weren't very religious. That changed when a Jehovah's Witness knocked on the door one afternoon. Joy answered, and everything changed. She quickly embraced the religion, attending meetings, studying the Bible, and going door to door to spread the faith. Christian and Dustin often joined her. Christian became good at it, too good. He learned how to speak convincingly, how to read people, and how to win them over.
The Bible says that you should not lie. The Bible actually says that there's resurrection of both righteous and unrighteous.
These were skills he would later use to deceive, not to save. But life in the Jehovah's Witness world was strict. You weren't allowed to be close to anyone outside the faith. Even close family members who left the church had to be cut off completely. That meant Christian grew up in a bubble. No outside friends, no room for mistakes, and no idea what the real world was like. In the early 90s, Joe got promoted again, and the family moved to Ypsilanti, Michigan. That's when Christian's life became even more isolated. He was pulled out of school and homeschooled. He still worked part-time and stayed active in church, but outside of that, he had almost no social life, no real friends, no freedom, just rules and routine. Christian looked like a model young man, but he was secretly craving something more, something bigger. And when he met Mary Jane, he thought he'd found it. Mary Jane Baker was 7 years older than Christian. At 25, she had a full-time job as a secretary at the University of Michigan's dental school. Like him, she was a Jehovah's Witness, and like him, she had her own wounds. She grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, the third of 5 kids. Her parents divorced when she was still a child. Her mother turned to the Jehovah's Witnesses for support, and Mary Jane followed her into the faith. Christian and Mary Jane met in a church parking lot. Their connection was fast and strong. She saw him as a kind, faithful young man with potential. He saw her as a way out, his ticket to a new kind of life. Their relationship moved quickly. But Christian's parents didn't approve. They thought he was too immature, too irresponsible, and too young for a serious relationship. They gave him a choice: stay home and stop seeing Mary Jane, or leave and be with her. Christian didn't hesitate. At just 18 years old, he packed his things and left home.
They gave me an ultimatum at that point. They said I was still fairly adamant that I wanted to date Mary Jane, and they essentially said you can either live under our roof or you can date Mary Jane. And I chose to move out that next week.
He stepped into adult life head first. No plan, no money, and no idea what was coming. He thought he was choosing love, but what he was really choosing was pressure, bills, and a growing mountain of lies he couldn't keep up with. This was the beginning of the unraveling. Growing up as a Jehovah's Witness, Christian lived a very sheltered life. He was homeschooled and wasn't allowed to play team sports, join school clubs, or even think about college. Anything that might teach him independence or real-world skills was strictly off-limits. But once he became an adult, reality hit him hard. He had to figure out life on his own, with little experience and even less guidance. For a while, Christian bounced around, staying with friends until he eventually found an apartment with a few roommates. Despite all the challenges, there was one bright spot. His relationship with Mary Jane was blossoming. Just 5 months after moving out, during a group trip to the Jehovah's Witness headquarters in Brooklyn, Christian took a big leap. In a quiet moment at a hotel restaurant, he pulled out a diamond ring and proposed. Mary Jane said yes, and their future together finally felt real. But love wasn't enough to pay the bills. Christian's new life of independence brought serious financial pressure, and soon he made a choice that would haunt him. At the time, Christian was working at a camera shop in a local mall, earning barely enough to cover his rent. The engagement ring he had bought for Mary Jane was still sitting heavily on his credit card. One day, when a customer made a $108 down payment on a camcorder, Christian saw a way out. Instead of putting the cash in the register, he slipped it into his pocket and rushed to the jewelry store to pay down the ring. He thought it was a small thing. No one would notice. When the store manager tallied up the receipts that night, the missing money was obvious. The next day, management started asking questions. Christian lied, saying he knew nothing, but the guilt ate away at him. By the next morning, he couldn't take it anymore. He left a resignation letter, his store keys, and a check for $108 on the counter, then walked away from the job for good. But quitting didn't erase what he had done. The manager pressed charges, and Christian was convicted of misdemeanor embezzlement. He was sentenced to 80 hours of community service. When Christian confessed everything to Mary Jane, he expected her to leave him. But she didn't. She forgave him and stayed by his side. He also confessed his wrongdoing to the Jehovah's Witness elders, which they punished him for by placing him on restrictions, stripping away certain privileges, including the right to marry at the Kingdom Hall, something Mary Jane had always dreamed of. Christian worried this would end their engagement. But once again, Mary Jane chose love over tradition. On March 13th, 1993, Christian and Mary Jane got married. After the wedding, Christian found a new job with Publishers Circulation Fulfillment, a company that delivered newspapers like the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills for a while. From the outside, it looked like Christian and Mary Jane were thriving. They went on vacations to Jamaica and Mexico, splurged on fancy camera equipment, and even bought a top-of-the-line computer. Family members quietly wondered how they could afford their flashy lifestyle. But behind closed doors, Christian and Mary Jane were drowning in debt. Christian had racked up over $1,400 on a retail credit card he opened in both their names, and he was also being sued for unpaid rent from a previous apartment. Still, they kept spending, choosing luxury over stability. On February 28, 1997, Christian and Mary Jane welcomed their first child, a son named Zachary. The new arrival added even more pressure. Christian worked hard and even earned a promotion, which meant more money, but it also meant bigger spending. He bought a new car and a pool table to show off his success, and even moved into a new house. The new house wasn't just about appearances. It made sense practically as they needed more space because another baby was on the way. On April 30th, 1998, their daughter Sadie was born. But just one day after Sadie's birth, life threw them another curveball. Christian's company needed him to go to San Francisco to manage newspaper deliveries during a major strike. Christian begged to stay. His wife had just given birth, but his bosses didn't care. Reluctantly, he traveled to San Francisco, leaving Mary Jane alone with a newborn and a toddler. The week-long separation was brutal, and when his employer told him he'd need to stay even longer, Christian snapped. In a fit of anger, he quit his job on the spot. His choice to walk away from steady employment marked the beginning of a downward spiral that would see his lies, debts, and irresponsibility deepen. Christian Longo had just started a new job selling fireplaces to local construction companies. It paid only commission, but it let him spend more time at home. The problem? The money was nowhere near what he used to make. Still, that didn't stop the Longo family from living large. In 1998, they took out a loan to buy a 1997 Sea-Doo Bombardier jet ski. Not long after, Christian financed a brand new Dodge Durango. These weren't necessities. They were luxuries, but to Christian, appearances were everything. At the same time, Mary Jane was pregnant with their third child, Madison. When Madison was born on October 19, 1999, she arrived 7 weeks early, struggling with severe breathing problems. She spent nearly a month in the hospital. Even though they had health insurance, it didn't cover everything. The family was slammed with huge medical bills, and their money problems didn't stop there. During this stressful time, Mary Jane's car was repossessed. But Christian wasn't upset about losing the car. What really terrified him was the thought that the neighbors might have seen it happen. Keeping up the image of success mattered more to him than anything else, even more than the reality they were living.
I was upset about that. I felt that at the outset I reasoned that this was something that she needed. I think internally I was probably thinking more about, what am I going to say to people now that our Ford Taurus has been taken? They're suddenly not going to see this car driving around. It was a pride issue with me as much as I think an inconvenience to Mary Jane.
By early 2000, Christian knew his sales job wouldn't save them. So he decided to launch his own business, Final Touch Construction Cleaning. The idea was simple: clean up newly built homes and get them ready for buyers. At first, things looked promising. Thanks to Christian's connections, work poured in. He hired a few employees and started billing thousands of dollars for jobs. On paper, they were thriving, but behind the scenes, trouble was brewing. In construction, payments often take weeks, even months, to come in. Christian needed cash now to pay his workers, but the money wasn't coming fast enough. Then, another blow. The Dodge Durango broke down. The repairs would cost thousands more, money they didn't have. Still, Christian kept pretending everything was fine. He told Mary Jane not to worry. Instead of facing reality, he turned to deception. Christian had always been obsessed with technology. By now, he had a high-end scanner and printer, good enough to fake official documents. And he had a plan. Christian scanned his Michigan driver's license, changed the details to create a new identity, and printed out a fake version. He laminated it carefully, trimming it to the right size. It didn't have the state's holographic seal, but he was betting the dealership wouldn't notice. On February 16, 2000, Christian drove a rental car into Ohio and dropped it off near a cluster of car dealerships. From there, he walked straight into a showroom and told a salesperson he wanted to test drive a fully loaded Pontiac Montana minivan. When asked for his license, Christian handed over his fake Michigan ID, the one that bore the name Jason Fortner. The salesperson made a quick photocopy, handed the ID back, and gave Christian the keys. Christian drove off the lot with no intention of ever coming back. When he pulled into the driveway, Mary Jane was overjoyed. Christian explained that he had scored a special deal, no payments for 90 days. It sounded like a miracle, and Christian reassured her that Final Touch would soon be booming enough to easily cover the cost. To hide the theft, Christian took the plates off his broken Dodge Durango and slapped them onto the stolen minivan. A few days later, he ordered personalized vanity plates for the Durango that read Kid Van. When the plates arrived, he swapped them onto the minivan and put the old plates back on the Durango. It was a smart move. In Michigan, vanity plates weren't tied to the type of vehicle, just the owner's name. If anyone ran the plates, it would trace straight back to Christian Longo, not a stolen minivan. The only clue left behind was a photocopy of the fake Jason Fortner ID, a dead end for police, since both the name and address were completely made up. But Christian wasn't done pushing his luck. When his in-laws moved to Indianapolis, Christian convinced his father-in-law to invest in opening a new branch of Final Touch. For a while, things actually looked good. The business was growing, and payments from contracts were starting to come in more regularly. But Christian's appetite for money and for deceit only grew stronger. Just 2 months after launching Final Touch, he quietly opened a second business account. This new account wasn't for legitimate income. It was for scams. Christian wrote bad checks to buy expensive equipment, like a forklift and trailer. And when the checks bounced, he sold the gear for $5,000 cash. Then he wrote himself another check for $5,900 and cashed it at a local credit union. That check bounced too, of course. When the original sellers reported the stolen forklift, Christian cooked up another lie, claiming it had been destroyed in a car accident. As the financial pressure piled up, cracks in Christian's personal life began to show. By May 2000, Mary Jane could no longer ignore the warning signs. She confided in her sister after discovering emails Christian had sent to another woman. It wasn't clear if the affair had become physical, but the betrayal cut deep. Still, determined to save their marriage, Mary Jane reported the situation to their church elders. Christian was sanctioned once again by the congregation. Another public embarrassment he could barely stand. By mid-2000, Christian's financial desperation led him to a new scheme, a scheme that eventually landed him in court for the first time. As Christian Longo's financial troubles deepened, his favorite tactic was simple: checks fraud. One of his biggest clients owed him thousands of dollars, at least according to Christian. Using his computer skills, he decided to forge checks, each matching one of the unpaid invoices he had sent the client. He printed the checks for varying amounts, deposited 3 of them into his account, and waited. No alarms, no questions. Feeling emboldened, Christian deposited the remaining checks in the following days. With fresh cash in his account, Christian managed to cover payroll, saving face in front of his employees, his family, and most importantly, his parents. Because for Christian Longo, keeping up appearances mattered more than anything. When payroll came due again 2 weeks later, he repeated the process, convincing himself he was only taking what he was owed. In his twisted logic, Wexford builders had brought this on themselves, so why would they ever press charges? On July 14, 2000, detectives called Christian in for questioning. At first, Christian tried to play it off as a simple business mistake, but the detectives weren't buying it. They made it clear each forged check carried up to 14 years in prison. When pushed, Christian finally admitted to cashing the fake checks, but defended himself by claiming he had only taken what he was rightfully owed. Unfortunately for him, the detectives had already spoken to the client, who confirmed that they owed Christian nowhere near the $35,000 he had stolen. The heat turned up even more when investigators asked about the equipment Christian had used to create the forged checks. They explained that a search warrant was imminent for Christian's home, his cars, his bank accounts. Christian knew what that meant. A search wouldn't just uncover the check fraud. They'd find the stolen minivan, the bad checks to banks, the fraudulent forklift purchase, the jet skis, the boat, the high-end toys he had passed off as business successes. It would all come crashing down. Despite everything, Christian managed to avoid jail, at least for the night. When authorities asked for the laptop used to forge the checks, Christian claimed it was inside the Durango, Mary Jane's truck. Mary Jane drove it down to the station and quietly paid a $100 bond to have Christian released. But whatever brief calm they had, it wouldn't last long. Detectives kept gathering evidence. Eventually, Christian pled guilty to 2 counts of forgery and 2 counts of uttering and publishing fraudulent documents. Given the scale of his crimes, Christian should have faced over a decade in prison. Instead, he got a slap on the wrist, 3 years of probation, community service, and an order to repay $29,868 in restitution. When the congregation learned about Christian's crimes, they made a decision that would isolate him and Mary Jane even further. They disfellowshipped him. Christian lost his church friends, his business network, and even members of his own family. And by extension, Mary Jane lost her entire community too. Now they had only each other. Facing shame and mounting debts, Christian and Mary Jane decided to disappear. They quietly sold their house, packed their belongings into the stolen Pontiac, Montana minivan and a rented trailer, and vanished. They resurfaced in Toledo, Ohio, where they moved into a grim warehouse. No kitchen, no running water, barely any plumbing. But the move wasn't just about escaping creditors, it was about isolating Mary Jane even further. What Mary Jane didn't realize was that Christian wasn't just running from money problems anymore. He was running from the truth. And soon, the cost of his lies would become unbearable. Once settled in Toledo, Christian began using a new bank account to cash forged checks. He used the names of other builders he had worked for, depositing the fraudulent checks into his account and withdrawing portions of the deposits in cash. This time, Christian didn't try to hide his tracks. He brazenly scammed cash wherever he could, showing no fear of getting caught. He placed an ad in the local paper, selling a skid loader. When a man came to look at the equipment, he became suspicious when Christian offered to sell a $30,000 piece of machinery for just $5,000. The potential buyer reported the suspicious offer to the police. Sergeant Paul Hickey and his team responded, heading to the warehouse to investigate. When Christian was questioned about the skid loader, he claimed it had been purchased a year prior, but couldn't provide the title or registration at that moment. Sergeant Hickey radioed in the serial number of the equipment, but the dispatch replied that it had not been reported as stolen. At first, neither Christian nor Mary Jane appeared suspicious, so Sergeant Hickey returned to the station. However, out of curiosity, he traced the skid loader's serial number to a dealer, who put him in touch with the buyer. The company, based in Ypsilanti, confirmed that the skid loader had gone missing 2 months earlier, but they never reported it as stolen. Sergeant Hickey gathered his team and rushed back to the warehouse, but by the time they arrived, Christian and his family were gone. Inside the warehouse, authorities discovered a large trailer, a boat, and a boat trailer, each of them reported as stolen. The family moved frequently, often staying in motels, campsites, or other cheap accommodations to evade authorities who were closing in on Longo's various schemes. Around September 2001, they eventually settled in Oregon in a small town called Yachats. Desperate for change, Christian made an attempt at legitimate work after arriving in Oregon. Knowing he couldn't apply for a job that would run a background check, Christian, with no real skills except his charm, applied for a position at a Starbucks located inside a Fred Meyer retailer. Embarrassed by his minimum wage job, Christian would tell his colleagues and acquaintances that he was a wealthy internet entrepreneur who worked at Starbucks purely out of his love for coffee. He even charmed the manager of the Landing condominiums into renting him a one-bedroom unit for $1,200 a month, despite knowing he couldn't afford it. Despite his efforts to maintain appearances, the family's financial struggles worsened. Christian's meager earnings from Starbucks were spent as soon as they came in. Food was scarce, gas was stolen, and the swindled condo was on the verge of being discovered. Despite his best efforts to move forward, Christian soon realized that his family was the most significant obstacle in his quest for a fresh start. Between December 16th and 17th, 2001, Christian Longo committed an act so monstrous it defies understanding. On the night of December 16th, Christian strangled his 34-year-old wife, Mary Jane, in their Oregon home.
He placed his hand on her throat and he began to squeeze. And in a violent struggle, she fought for her life. But she wasn't able to overcome the defendant. In a matter of 3 or 4 minutes, she was dead.
After killing Mary Jane, Christian turned on their youngest child, 2-year-old Madison. He strangled the toddler and stuffed both her and her mother's bodies into large suitcases. Under cover of darkness, Christian carried the lifeless bodies to the Embarcadero Marina, a peaceful, unsuspecting spot along the Newport waterfront. There, he dropped the suitcases into the frigid water, hoping they would never resurface. But Christian wasn't finished. Later that night, he returned home and loaded his 4-year-old son, Zachary, and 3-year-old daughter, Sadie, into a stolen minivan. They likely had no idea that this drive in the early morning hours would be their last. Christian drove 16 miles south to a bridge spanning Lintslow in Waldport. At just after 4 a.m. on December 17th, Christian enacted the next stage of his plan. He tied a pillowcase filled with rocks around Zachary's ankle and threw him over the bridge. Then he did the same to Sadie. Their small bodies disappeared into the icy black water as their father stood above them, watching. The man who had once read them bedtime stories had become their executioner. No one heard their cries. No one came to save them. Christian drove back to the family's empty house, his children now gone, and acted as if nothing had happened. He didn't turn himself in. Instead, he focused on how to disappear. The next day, on December 8th, he traveled to Wilsonville, just south of Portland. There, he parked the stolen Montana minivan at a Dodge dealership and slipped away with a new green Dodge Durango. He had removed the license plates, hoping to fly under the radar. The dealership employees thought it was a standard test drive. It wasn't until the following day, when the Durango was missing and the minivan was discovered, that they realized they'd been robbed. By then, Christian Longo had vanished. Police launched a manhunt, but the trail had already gone cold. The brutal nature of the murders, the missing father, and the calculated attempts to erase his tracks made national headlines. As more clues emerged, Christian became the FBI's prime suspect. Authorities placed him on their 10 most wanted list, elevating the urgency of the search. But Christian was already out of the country. Using a credit card he'd stolen from a Starbucks customer, he purchased a plane ticket and fled to Cancun, Mexico. It was a calculated escape funded by theft. In Cancun, he checked into a hostel, blending in with tourists and backpackers from around the world. He was just another sunburnt American enjoying the beach, except he wasn't. In Mexico, Christian tried to earn money by offering writing services, but his charm could only take him so far. Running out of cash, he traveled further south to Tulum, a bohemian beach paradise known for its laid-back vibe. It was there that he met Janina, a young German photojournalist. Seeking a fresh start, or at least a temporary identity, Christian introduced himself as Michael Finkel, a name he had plucked from the headlines. The real Michael Finkel had recently been fired from the New York Times for fabricating parts of a major feature story. To Christian, the name represented more than just a disguise. It was a persona he longed to inhabit, a successful globe-trotting writer, a man of intellect and charm, someone who wasn't a murderer. Ironically, while Longo pretended to be Finkel, the real Finkel's life was in shambles back in the U.S. The disgraced journalist would eventually learn of Longo's impersonation and surprisingly, their lives would intertwine in ways no one could have predicted. But back in Tulum, Christian was enjoying the fantasy. He and Janina collaborated on a piece about Mayan mysticism. Janina, unaware of his past, saw a charming, intelligent man chasing a dream. He was hiding in plain sight. That illusion, however, was short-lived. On January 12, 2002, America's Most Wanted aired a segment on Christian Longo. It included a detailed description of the murders and an alert for viewers to report any sightings. Someone who had shared a hostel with Christian in Cancun saw the broadcast and contacted the FBI. By the time authorities arrived at the hostel, Christian had already moved. But the net was tightening. A day later, a tour guide in Tulum recognized him and called the FBI. Local police were notified and began their search. When they finally found him at a beachside campground, Christian was cooperative. He admitted his real name. "Yes," he told the FBI agent, "I am Christian Michael Longo." Rather than face the dangers of a Mexican prison, Christian agreed to be deported to the United States, where he would stand trial for the brutal murders of his wife and children. With Christian Longo now in custody, the stage was set for the legal drama to unfold. At the beginning of 2003, journalist Michael Finkel received a phone call that would change the trajectory of his life. On the other end of the line was a reporter from the Oregonian, asking for his thoughts on a man named Christian Longo, a fugitive accused of brutally murdering his entire family. Finkel was baffled. He had never met Christian, never even heard of him. Yet, here was a man accused of one of the most heinous crimes imaginable, using his identity like a costume. Finkel did what journalists do best. He dug deeper. He contacted Christian Longo, who was by then incarcerated and awaiting trial. To Finkel's surprise, Christian responded with enthusiasm. He claimed to be an admirer of Finkel's work and said he had followed his journalism career closely. What followed was an unlikely and unsettling arrangement. Christian Longo would share his version of events, but only if Finkel gave him writing lessons, and kept their communication private until after the trial. Finkel, perhaps driven by curiosity, ego, or the promise of a unique story, agreed. What started as a professional interest quickly turned into a messy and obsessive relationship. Over time, Christian's intellect, charm, and calculated openness began to disarm Finkel. Christian was willing to admit he'd made mistakes, financial fraud, infidelity, and poor judgment, but he remained elusive about the murders. In their frequent phone calls and extensive letters, Christian offered multiple narratives, often contradicting himself, always dancing around the question of guilt. In one especially chilling account, Christian described the act of tossing his 2 children off a bridge while they were still alive. Even though the whole situation was disturbing, Finkel found himself emotionally drawn in. He started to notice strange similarities between himself and Christian. Both of them had lied to the public and faced serious shame because of it. Finkel had lost his job at the New York Times after making up parts of a story, which damaged his reputation. And in Christian, he saw a reflection of himself, a man who was charming, dishonest, and had fallen hard. But in Christian's case, those traits were taken to a much darker and more extreme level. As their bond deepened, Christian made a sudden and puzzling announcement just before the trial was set to begin in March 2003. He planned to plead guilty, but only partially. At the trial, Christian admitted to killing his wife, Mary Jane, and their youngest daughter, Madison. But for the murders of Zachary and Sadie, his 2 older children, he refused to enter a plea. The court, following procedure, entered a not guilty plea on his behalf. Finkel was stunned. He confronted Christian, demanding an explanation. Christian, ever cryptic, said he couldn't reveal everything. "I have to protect certain people," he said, offering no further details. The FBI agent who arrested Christian was worried about how close Finkel was getting to him. He warned Finkel that Christian was manipulative and dangerous. The agent asked Finkel to share what he had learned from their letters. But Finkel thought he was the one in control. And maybe, tempted by the chance to write a great story, he said no. As the trial unfolded, the prosecution painted Christian as a calculating sociopath who had viewed his family not as loved ones, but as burdens. They presented evidence that he had been preparing for the murders for months. His computer history revealed repeated visits to an online version of a book titled Hitman, which detailed step by step how to carry out a murder and dispose of bodies. The chilling part? Many of the book's suggestions, using concrete blocks, wrapping bodies tightly, mirrored how Mary Jane, Madison, Zachary, and Sadie were found. Investigators found obituaries that Christian had clipped and marked, a clear sign he was planning to create a new identity. He had already begun wiping away his past, throwing away family keepsakes, getting rid of his children's clothes and toys, and even tossing out photos. Prosecutors argued that his goal was to completely erase his old life and start over, alone. There was no direct evidence linking Christian to the murders, no smoking gun, no DNA. But the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses placed him at key locations. A neighbor recalled hearing dragging noises from their condo. A woman claimed to have spoken to him on the bridge where the children's bodies were found. And then there were Christian's own words, captured by the FBI. When asked if there was anyone else involved in the murders, Christian answered calmly, "Not that I'm aware of."
Let me ask you this, Chris. Is there anyone else we need to be looking for the deaths of your family? And here's his reply. Not that I'm aware of.
The prosecution argued that Christian's motive came from desperation. Once financially well off, he had lost everything. They described a family that went from enjoying shopping sprees to struggling just to find spare change for bread and ramen noodles. Christian himself said, "We were pulling pennies out of the ashtray. It never got better. We were used to eating whatever we could, not thinking much about it. Now we were trying to figure out how to make it work with just $5. He allegedly returned home every day to the same painful reality, mouths to feed and nothing to give them. Prosecutors claimed that in his warped mind, murdering his family was not cruelty. It was a mercy, a way out, a twisted act of liberation. The defense, not surprisingly, strongly disagreed. They argued that without clear evidence, the prosecution's version of events was just a story. They questioned the eyewitness testimonies and pointed out problems with the timeline. One defense argument even suggested that the family had visited Christian at work after he was supposedly seen committing the murders. More importantly, the defense fixated on the inconsistencies in how the bodies were disposed of. Mary Jane and Madison were placed carefully in suitcases. Zachary and Sadie were thrown in the water with heavy weights. Why the difference? Then came the trial's most dramatic moment. Christian Longo took the stand. His attorneys were uneasy. Longo insisted on testifying, saying he needed to air what needed to be aired. His team couldn't stop him, and perhaps he didn't want to be stopped. On the stand, Christian was composed, charismatic, and disturbingly likable. He spoke about his religious upbringing, quoted scripture, and emphasized his moral compass. Christian stunned the courtroom with his own version of the events. He claimed that on December 15th, he and Mary Jane had gone on a date. She confronted him about his lies, financial fraud, infidelity, the stolen family van. They argued. He went to bed, uncertain about coming clean entirely. But when Mary Jane confronted him again the next day, he claimed he confessed everything. Mary Jane was furious. She slapped him, called him a liar, and told him she would never trust him again. He slept on the couch. The next morning, he said, Mary Jane forced him to go to work, despite his pleas to stay home. She dropped him off, barefoot and wearing a bathrobe. That night, when he returned home, she wouldn't go inside. Inside the condo, he said, he found Madison dead. Panicked, he asked Mary Jane what happened. She told him she had already killed the other 2 children and thrown them in the bay. "You did this," she allegedly screamed at him. "You killed us." Christian claimed he snapped. In a rage, he strangled Mary Jane with his bare hands. Then, believing Madison was already dead, he placed her in a suitcase, only to discover she was still breathing faintly. Rather than seek help, he admitted placing his hand over her throat and finishing the job. It was horrifying, tragic, and the prosecution argued utterly unbelievable. They pointed out that Mary Jane, slight and barely over 100 pounds, would not have been physically capable of tying heavy rocks to the children and disposing of their bodies in such a calculated way. They said the contradictions in Christian's story weren't just convenient, they were manipulative. a final attempt to save even a small bit of innocence in a case where the truth had already been lost. In the end, the jury found Christian Longo guilty on all 4 counts of murder, and he was sentenced to death. But here's the twist. Christian Longo may have been sentenced to death, but in the state of Oregon, a death sentence doesn't always mean execution. Back in 2011, then-Governor John Kitzhaber placed a moratorium on executions, calling the system compromised and inequitable. And every governor since has upheld that pause, effectively freezing capital punishment in the state. Then in 2022, Governor Kate Brown made a historic move. She didn't just continue the moratorium, she took it a step further. She officially commuted the sentences of all 17 inmates on Oregon's death row, including Christian Longo. Their death sentences were replaced with life imprisonment, without the possibility of parole. So what does that mean for Christian Longo? Well, even though the court sentenced him to die for the brutal murders of his wife and 3 young children, the reality is that he won't face a lethal injection. Instead, he'll live out the rest of his days in a prison cell, with nothing but time to reflect on what he's done. He may have escaped execution, but not justice. His fate is sealed and will die behind bars. As for Michael Finkel, he turned his strange connection with Longo into a best-selling book, which later became a movie. But the experience changed him forever. He was haunted by how easily he had been fooled by a man who could commit such horrible acts. If you're shocked by this story, then the story of how Sherry and her 2 sons tragically lost their lives will leave you questioning everything. You can tap on the screen to watch, and make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. Thank you for watching. See you on the next one.